Evening, everyone. Thank you for coming back. Um, Tonight, I'm going to be talking about Rome. Last week, I talked about Greece, and I'm going to follow a similar format. Um, Ideally, if I were doing this as a semester-long course, I would give a little more time to Rome than to Greece, simply because Rome, in the sense of the Roman Empire, was so vast. And there's just so much to cover if you want to do sort of a survey of Roman architecture. That I'm not going to be able to do in the allotted time. So I'm going to focus on some key monuments and a few areas that are a little bit more general. And I want to talk about the specifically Roman contributions to Western architecture, and particularly what they did with the classical language of architecture that they inherited from the Greeks. So, without further ado, history of Western architecture, the architecture of classical Rome, with a marvelous Beaux-Arts drawing of the Roman Forum, which you're going to be seeing again a little bit later in this evening's talk. So as I did last week, let's start with just the very, very basic lay of the land. Not only was the Roman Empire vast in terms of geography, but it also goes on for a really long time. And there are so many episodes of Roman history that even if you've been studying the subject for a long time, you kind of always have to be referring to reference books to get your bearings. But basically what you're seeing is a map of the Italian peninsula around 400 BC. And as you can see, it is only a very sort of slender slice of the western coast that is labeled Romans. Rome was just a city-state among others, and it wasn't the dominant city-state of Italy. Just to the north of where it says Romans, you see a red shaded area that says Etruscans. Basically, the Etruscans were or as we always say, the mysterious Etruscans, because we know far, far less about the Etruscans than we would like to know. They are indeed still, to us today, very mysterious people and a fascinating people, but they were for quite some time the dominant people of the Italian peninsula, and they basically controlled the Romans until the Romans flipped the table and controlled the Etruscans. Here are some key dates. As I did last week, so you have a basic sense of the chronology as we're going along. 509 BC, the traditional date, probably not the real date, but by tradition, the date of the founding of the Roman Republic. Then you see that there is that period in the 3rd to 4th centuries BC when Rome conquers all of Italy. We're not going to go into any details of that history. Suffice it to say, Rome conquered Italy before Rome conquered the world. The conquering of the world really begins with the Punic Wars with Carthage, in which it took a while, but Rome laid waste to Carthage and made all of Carthage's possessions Rome's possessions. And that's pretty much how Rome expanded to North Africa. There is the late Republican period, as it is called, which is very important. It ends with, or doesn't end with, but near the end of that, the assassination of Julius Caesar. And then Julius's adopted son, Octavian, who would later bear the name Augustus, um, defeats the forces of Mark Antony and Cleopatra in the Battle of Actium, and the reign of Augustus establishes what we call the Roman Empire. And not all, but a good bit of what we are going to be covering is imperial Roman architecture. The Roman Empire is fairly long-lived, and again, the end date, it all depends on how you define your terms, but let's, as I say, not make too much of that right now. I mentioned the reigns of three emperors, Trajan, Hadrian, and Diocletian, because it was an architecturally very rich period. The period of Trajan really the sort of transitional period from Trajan to Hadrian is what we may call the empire at its zenith. That sort of well-oiled machine that was the Roman Empire at its height. And then began the decline. And finally, Constantine sort of moves the seat of empire out of Rome to Byzantium. And that will be the subject of lecture number 3 when we have that schedule. Roman Empire in 117 AD, that's the year of the changeover from Trajan to Diocletian. And you can see the extent of the empire. It was quite remarkable. What we today call England was part of the Roman Empire. France was part of the Roman Empire. Libya was part of the Roman Empire. Syria and Lebanon were part of the Roman Empire. Greece was part of the Roman Empire, and so on. These are the principal emperors whose names you need to know. There were many others. All of them have wonderful stories attached to their names. Some of them were, as you know, complete nut jobs. Others were very able administrators, and several of them were outstanding patrons of art and architecture. These things were very, very important to the emperors as a way of glorifying themselves and glorifying the empire. Augustus is the first really important name, and others, as I say, that are important to us would be Trajan, Hadrian, Septimius Severus, and Diocletian. And here are some notable Romans, writers, thinkers, poets, what have you. Cicero, of course, was a great, and I've always been deeply charmed by the fact that in Italy, a tour guide is known as a cicerone after Cicero. And the reason for that is that the tour guide is somebody who has the knowledge and eloquence of Cicero. But to me, some of these names actually mean a very great deal in terms of being sort of my own intellectual touchstones. Strabo, Pliny the Elder, Pausanias particularly are very important names to me personally. And you can see there are the others, Virgil and Horace and Ovid, these names that are very, very familiar to us all. So Rome, in its formative years, Rome looked to Greece for a very great deal. Roman writers, thinkers, philosophers were steeped in Greek culture. They venerated Greek culture, and indeed among themselves spoke Greek, which is very interesting. It's like the Russian nobility that among themselves spoke French. It was a sign of very deep respect, of admiration, and of a desire to emulate. But the Romans did not import Greek culture wholesale. And the reason for this is that they also were rather deeply respectful of Etruscan culture. And so we find that Rome is, when it comes to the arts, when it comes to culture, generally a kind of combination of the Etruscans and the Greeks with concrete added. So this is partly the approach that I'm going to be taking. This is a Tuscan temple. I'm going to be talking about the Roman orders a lot more. But here you see a building which exhibits what we call the Tuscan order. To the three orders the Greeks bequeathed Rome, the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian, the Romans added a couple of others. They added the Tuscan, which drives people crazy because people are always saying, is that Tuscan or is that Doric? And then they also added something that we call composite. We'll maybe get round to the composite, but the Tuscan order the Romans employed because it was something that came from the Etruscans. Anything that is involved in Roman history that goes by the name of Tuscan, because Tuscany was part of Etruria. And anything called Tuscan, we might also call Etruscan. So the Tuscan order could be called the Etruscan order, but we call it the Tuscan order. It is indeed similar to the Doric, but as we shall see, there are some differences. Another thing that the Romans borrowed from the Etruscans is the arch. The arch plays a very important role in Roman architecture. It gives us the vault, which is the extrusion of an arch along an axis, and it gives us the dome, which you get by rotating the arch 360 degrees through its center. And this was an Etruscan inheritance of the Romans and something with which they ran. Just like they took the Greeks' Corinthian order and ran with it, they took the Etruscan arch and ran with it. What they got from the Greeks was, in large measure, their sculpture. The Romans were simply in awe of Greek sculpture, and most of the Greek sculpture with which we are today familiar comes to us from Roman copies of Greek statues. For instance, there's this very beautiful statue of Aphrodite in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which is a Roman copy made circa AD 100 of a Greek original from circa 200 BC. And we see this over and over and over again. The Romans exhibited precious little originality when it came to sculpture or painting, for that matter, relying to such very, very great extent on Greek models. And the other thing that the Romans took from the Greeks in the arts was, of course, the orders. They took Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. And we will see what they did with these and the way that they made them into something that was fundamentally different from what they were for the Greeks. But here we see the three Greek orders, and here we see the five Roman orders, which are the Tuscan, the Doric, the Ionic, the Corinthian, and the composite. Here we see all the orders laid out. Greek Doric, which is different from the Roman Doric. We'll explore this a little bit more in a second. The Ionic and the Corinthian, yes, there were variations, but not as great. and then the Tuscan was something that the Romans added. So here we see side by side a Roman temple and a Greek temple. And the Roman temple on the left features the Roman Doric order, and the Greek temple on the right features the Greek Doric order. And if this were interactive right now, I would be making you tell me what are the differences that you see. And of course, if my own experience shall be a guide, the thing that you probably first notice is, because it's so obvious, is that the Roman Doric actually rises from a base, whereas the Greek Doric rises direct from the floor. So this is a difference, and to most people, this is the basic difference between Roman Doric and Greek Doric. But look at this side-by-side comparison of a Greek Doric building, the Parthenon, the most famous Doric building in the universe, and a Roman Doric building, the Theater of Marcellus. Now, if you look very closely, you will see that the Roman Doric, at the end column, centers the triglyphs over the column capital, right directly centers it over the column abacus. And the Greeks did not do that. The Romans thought that the way the Greeks did it was it did not sort of appeal to their OCD side. And they kind of wrenched things around a bit so that they could center those triglyphs. It may not seem like a big deal, but it is a difference between the Greek Doric and the Roman Doric. So the difference is in the base, and the difference is also in the entablature. When we talk about Roman architecture, we almost always invoke the great Roman architectural theorist, I suppose we would call him, the man who wrote kind of the handbook of practice for Roman architects, the fellow whom we call Vitruvius, who lived in the reign of Augustus, and who in so many ways both sort of codified the principles of practice of Roman architecture up till his time, and in so doing provided a kind of ready handbook or reference for architects and builders moving forward. Vitruvius's name has resounded throughout the history of architecture. The writers of all the great architectural treatises, such as Palladio, bowed to Vitruvius. They studied Vitruvius and viewed themselves as updating Vitruvius. I mentioned last week that the philosopher Whitehead said of Plato that all philosophy since Plato is but a footnote to Plato. You know, maybe somewhere someone said that all architectural theory since Vitruvius is a footnote to Vitruvius. And indeed, we can kind of view the great treatises throughout the history of Western architecture as being a series of footnotes, sometimes a very long series of footnotes, but a series of footnotes to Vitruvius. And then I said that the Romans took elements from the Etruscans, they took elements from the Greeks, and they added concrete. What is that all about? The Romans, this is something that may be a little hard to get one's head around. The Romans were an innovative people up to an extent. We can see that as the empire wore on, they became very rather complacent in their ways. They were notably uninnovative. But the great Roman innovation was indeed to do with the building material that we call concrete. Concrete is an aggregate. It's not something that you quarry from the ground. It is an aggregate that may be composed of different things: stone, broken brick, flint, clinker, sand, bound together by a cement, lime, and water mortar. And the concrete enabled the Romans to do a number of things. It enabled them to build those massive vaults and domes. It enabled them to build massively. And this is a keynote of Roman architecture: size, something that I'll be getting back to. But it also enabled the Romans to build very quickly and economically. The Romans were indeed making use of two things that vastly aided rapid building: concrete and slaves. They were able, through such means, to not only expand the empire militarily, but really to build an empire of towns and cities and temple complexes, and not least of all, and perhaps most of all, remarkable infrastructure of roads and bridges and harbor works and sewers and water mains that would not be equaled in Western history for millennia, which is certainly a remarkable achievement, and also certainly something that probably everybody knows about the Romans. An example of Roman infrastructure would be their tremendous aqueducts, which are utilitarian structures like the Pont du Gard, Nîmes, in the south of France. Utilitarian though they may be, they are one of those instances of a utilitarian structure that is also breathtakingly beautiful. But this is one of the things that we associate with the Romans. And the Romans also, now I had thought when I first thought of doing this talk that one of the things that I would touch on in some detail would be these incredible, in some instances, cities, in other instances, temple complexes that they built in some of the farther flung reaches of the empire, that to this day, in their ruined state, still inspire awe in us. And when we study them and learn more about them, we're in awe, first of all, of the sheer effort that had to have gone in to the creation of places like the temple complex at Baalbek, which is in Lebanon, with some of the biggest buildings that had ever been built up till that time. Or how about the city of Leptis Magna, which is in Libya? This was a city that was, acquired by the Romans in their defeat of the Carthaginians in the Punic Wars. But it really wasn't until the reign of Septimius Severus, who was, by the way, born in Leptis Magna, that the city was, how shall we say, glorified and turned into one of the most magnificent places in the Roman Empire. What makes Leptis Magna a place of such great fascination for us today is that so much of it has been uncovered. It's not like a Roman city like London, where a new city was built on top of the Roman city, and yet newer cities were built on top of that. So that you go to London today and the Roman echoes are very few and far between. Instead, Leptis Magna was never built over. It was rather buried, buried in sand, and then recovered by archaeologists. And do let me say right now, because it's something that needs to be said at some point, um, much of Roman antiquity was uncovered in the interwar period under Mussolini. Mussolini was, you know, very interested in the Roman Empire and in drawing parallels between his fascist regime and the empire. Consequently, government sponsorship of archaeology and of historical research was very, very high during that period of time. And the recovery of Leptis Magna, which goes on to this day, began at that time. But I just wanted to mention these places, which are certainly worth your while to explore on your own. I want to break down what follows into a brief discussion of the forums in Rome itself, the city of Rome itself, and then talk about temple architecture, as we did with the Greeks, and then discuss a few other building types, such as basilicas and bathhouses, which were very important to the Romans. One thing that may be said of the Romans is that no people in the West, at least, up until the Romans, had ever placed such a high premium on cleanliness, including personal cleanliness, something that simply wasn't important to the Greeks, but was to the Romans. So the bathhouse is a very sort of characterizing building type of the Romans. Palaces, you need to say something about the great palaces, and we will. And then I'd like to finish up with what I think are the two most important contributions of Rome to the architecture of the West moving forward. That would be the triumphal arch and the Colosseum, which is a more influential building than it is a good building. But we'll get to that. And then a couple of concluding remarks. And with luck, we're not going to be going over time. So you hear people say the Roman forum, singular, whereas here I say the forums. And indeed, there are forums, because there was in the beginning the Forum Romanum, the Roman Forum. But emperors tended to add to it, to add new forums to the old forums. Not really as though they took the old forum and they expanded it, but they built adjacent to it new forums. So that, you know how in some cities you talk about the old city and the new city. In Rome, you can talk about the old forum and the new forum and the newer forum and the forum that's even newer than that. So that in the end, there was a whole bunch of forums. But basically, they're all clustered together in this region of Rome, demarcated by the Capitoline and Palatine Hills. An arrow here points to the location of the original Roman Forum, and another arrow points, just for sake of reference, to the Colosseum, which is a very good reference point in Rome. This is a computer-generated model of the Roman Forum. And here, let me say that there is an industry out there of people who make images of reconstructions of ancient Roman architecture. And for somebody like me, who's eager to show pictures of this stuff is invaluable. We're not going to quibble so much on accuracy of these things. Not tonight. We're not going to do that kind of quibbling. But some of it is, it's all very impressive stuff. Italo Gismondi, who worked, an architect and archaeologist, whom I'm going to be mentioning many times, worked under Mussolini, created those spectacular models that are in the Civic Museum in Rome. But today, likelier than not, people aren't creating models, they're creating physical models, they're creating computer-generated images. And here is one, and we're going to be showing that again. We also have many very striking images of the forums, both as they were when they were new and particularly in their ruined state. This is true of Greece as well. Artists have been drawn to the ruins. And the ruins make us very thoughtful. We look at these ruins, we know that they are the ruins of what once was the most powerful civilization the world had known. And today, of course, they are ruins. And here we see the ruins of the Forum by Canaletto. Now, Canaletto ordinarily depicted scenes, well, always depicted scenes of what was around him. We know his works, his depictions of Venice and his depictions of London, but he also spent time in Rome. And here he shows us ruins of the Forum looking towards the capital, and that is the ruin, the remains, what remains of the Temple of Castor and Pollux, more about which anon. Here we see a photo of the old Forum and its ruins, the Arch of Septimius Severus, which is, relatively intact, the Temple of Saturn, which is not intact, but which at least gives us some sense of the building and its space as a whole, and the Temple of Castor and Pollux, which is reduced to 3 columns. Claude Lorraine painted what is called the Campo Vaccino, which is actually what people called the old Forum during the years when it was a cow pasture. A cow pasture dotted with these crumbling columns. And here we see the same things that we saw in the last picture, but from a slightly different angle. So here we see a map of the Roman Fora, or the Forums. You see at the bottom the Forum Romanum, and I have arrows pointing to the Temple of Castor and Pollux, the Arch of Augustus, the Temple of Caesar. But you will also note that just above all of that is a series of other forums: the Forum of Trajan, the Forum of Augustus, the Forum of Nerva, the Forum of Vespasian, and the Forum of Caesar. This is the view of the Roman Forum from the Palatine Hill. And this is a rendering by a Beaux-Arts architect, winner of the Prix de Rome. It was almost obligatory for a Prix de Rome winner to create dazzling visions of ancient Rome. And here we see in this marvelous image 3 temples, those of Saturn, Vespasian, and Concord, and the Arch of Septimius Severus, and the great the records building, the Tabularium. This is the Forum of Augustus. And the major building there is the Temple of Mars Ultor, which you'll see up close in a moment. And then something which is labeled the Quadriga of Augustus, which we know, as we know so many things about ancient Rome, through the images on coins. Roman coins are a great field of study. Museums are filled with Roman coins. And here in New York, we have, of course, the Greek and Roman galleries in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but a marvelous museum in the Bronx at Fordham University, the Fordham Museum of Greek, Etruscan, and Roman Art, which has many wonderful coins in its collection. But this is from another New York institution, the American Numismatic Society, which shows Augustus in a chariot pulled by 4 horses. And this particular image, this arrangement, the chariot pulled by 4 horses, we call a quadriga. And there was also a quadriga atop the Arch of Augustus. This is one of the characterizing Roman forms. And it's a form which has been adopted and adapted by other nations and other periods. And in New York, you can see a beautiful quadriga atop the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Arch in Brooklyn, created by the sculptor Frederick MacMonnies. And another way that Augustus sort of burnished his legend was through the erection of columns, but a particular kind of column known as a rostral column, in which the rams and anchors of captured ships in battle, like the Battle of Actium, were affixed to the column. So if you were to get back in the time machine and go back to the Roman Forum in 1st century BC, you'd see these rostral columns, as they are called. And this became another, like the quadriga, of the characterizing Roman forms. Again, one which has been adopted and adapted, as, for example, in the rostral column of the Christopher Columbus Monument in Columbus Circle in New York City, a Roman rostral column in New York City. So here's that architect archaeologist Gismondi, who worked for Mussolini and created the models which are in the Museo della Civiltà in Romana, where we see the Arch of Septimius Severus and one of the many, many, many equestrian statues, another characterizing Roman form that does not exist any longer. We still have the great equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius in the Campidoglio, but so many of the others are long vanished. This is a model of Trajan's Forum, where we see the equestrian statue of Trajan, and Trajan's Basilica Ulpia, and Trajan's Column, which in my view is one of the very greatest works of art in Western history, and something I'll be discussing later towards the end. So as we talked about Greek temples, let's look at Roman temples. At first blush, there are more similarities than differences between Roman temples and Greek temples. This looks like it could be a Greek temple. It's the Temple of Portunus, also known as the Temple of Fortuna Virilis in Rome. Note the date, 120 to 80 BC. It is tetra-style, pseudo-peripteral. You remember those words from last week, I hope? Ionic temple. And it looks like something the Greeks might have built, doesn't it? Except that although the Greeks did build pseudo-peripteral temples, the Romans kind of made it their default. The Greeks did not. The Greeks, given their druthers would always build a true peripteral temple. And it's been said that the Romans built their temples in that the Romans did not isolate their temple for the most part, generalizing. They did not isolate their temples in the way that was customary for the Greeks. The Greeks, the temple was something that was set apart. It was set apart. It was a sacred realm, and it wasn't right in the middle of the agora. Whereas the Romans built temples right in the forum, with the result that the Roman temples were crowded together with other temples and other buildings of all kinds, including like shops and so forth, with the result that it didn't make as much sense for them to build peripteral temples, which kind of need room to stretch their limbs. The Roman temples are sort of, more, we might say, urban temples. And just like, the urban row house is something very different from the country house. The Romans tended not to build this sort of peripteral colonnade with the cella in kind of almost like a separate structure inside that peristyle, but to make these pseudo-peripteral temples the engaged columns along the sides. Another view of the Temple of Portunus. This is one of those wonderful pages from Sir Bannister Fletcher's A History of Architecture on the Comparative Method, a book which first appeared at the beginning of the 20th century and which is now in its 20th edition, and a book that I recommend very, very highly to anybody who's interested in the history of architecture. You'd think that it's a massive book. My 18th edition is slip-cased, and it's something you absolutely don't want to drop on your foot. But let me say about it that although the writing in the book is extraordinarily charmless, as a kind of instrument for the quick retrieval of information, particularly visual information about buildings through history, it is 10 times better than Google. You can put your finger on what you want faster in Bannister Fletcher than you can by Googling. Believe me, it's absolutely the case. Another view of the Temple of Portunus, and this is the back, where, as you can see, only the front has the freestanding colonnade. This is the Temple of Antoninus and Faustina in Rome from AD 141. And please just, put your own C period in front of that. This is another of this fellow's computer-generated models. I do put the URL of his website because you might wish to explore it. But here we see hexastyle Corinthian pseudo-peripteral, actually a temple, which in its ruined state is very interesting because it was added to, it was turned into a Catholic church, and the elements of the ruins were kept with a sort of new building appended to them. And this is Piranesi's drawing of the ruin of Antoninus and Faustina. Piranesi gives us some of the most compelling images of ancient Rome, and I'm going to be making use of him going forward. Here is a reconstruction of the Forum of Augustus with the Temple of Mars Ultor, an octa-style Corinthian temple, as it may have looked originally. And you see that the Romans did, as the Greeks did, place figure sculpture within the pediment, in the tympanum of the pediment. They also used what we call polychromy, the architect's preferred word for color. They used color. And also, as acroteria, they used statues. So it's a very grand and very exciting building. And this is what remains of it. So when you're looking at Roman architecture, as when you're looking at Greek architecture, you want to look side by side, if you can, at images of the ruin, such as it is today, and at the artists or the archaeologists' reconstruction of what the building may have looked like, possibly looked like, or probably looked like when it was new. But as for the ruins, lest you think that they tell us very little, the truth of the matter is that many of the details which have survived in the ruins, things like column capitals or entablature details, have been enormously influential over the years, and that's something that I'm going to be illustrating presently. We've already seen in several images those three columns, those three haunting columns in the old Roman Forum, which are what remains of the Temple of Castor and Pollux, which was built between 7 BC and AD 6. This is Palladio's rendering of the Temple of Castor and Pollux, how he believed it originally looked. You know that Palladio went to Rome. He sort of rooted about Rome. He was very conversant with Vitruvius, and he sought made his own reconstructions of Roman buildings, which were to be very influential on his own and his followers' practice of architecture. Palladio was indeed, all of the Italian Renaissance was kind of a Roman revival, but there are parts of the Renaissance that are much more of a Roman revival than others, and Palladio represents a real Roman revival. You could almost say that Palladio was a neoclassical revivalist. This is one artist's rendering of the Corinthian capital of the Temple of Castor and Pollux. Another wonderful source for learning about classical architecture is on ICAA's website, the series of articles called Classical Comments by the wonderful architectural historian Calder Loth. And Calder has an essay on the Corinthian of the Temple of Castor and Pollux. It is well worth reading. But let's look at this column capital, because I said last week that I was going to wait to really sort of bring in the Corinthian order, even though the Greeks invented the Corinthian order and did use it, though very sparingly. The Romans decided they loved the Corinthian order and they made it their main order. There was something about the Corinthian, its richness, its elaboration, that to the Romans was more suited to their aim of glorifying empire or glorifying the exploits of emperors. Um, and indeed, when we see Corinthian columns today, when we see them in New York or Memphis or Denver, we 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 have a tendency to think that the architect or the client, more specifically, is being showy. Showy. It's a showy order. You may love the Corinthian order, but there is always that sort of residue of oh, they're showing off. It's a showy order. There's no getting around it. I mean, look at it. It's very showy. But let's look at some of the elements. You have, for instance, the one thing that everybody knows is the big part of the Corinthian column, and that's the acanthus leaf. Now, it doesn't have to be acanthus leaves. Architects have substituted other leaves. Some American architects, I believe, beginning with, an Englishman who worked in America, Benjamin Henry Latrobe, substituted tobacco leaves. I mean, if the Greeks and Romans used the acanthus because it was an indigenous Mediterranean plant, why shouldn't Americans use a leaf that was important to America? That being the tobacco, I mean, this, in terms of the importance of tobacco to the early American economy, the tobacco leaf. But ordinarily, it is the acanthus leaf. And we see that always in these Greek and Roman Corinthian columns, but there's more going on besides. The leaves rise up, and from within bundle or basket of leaves spring volutes, which are not so different from the volutes of the Ionic order. Now, later on, there'd be a new order called the composite order, which is typically defined as combining the Corinthian and the Ionic. But isn't this already something which incorporates the Ionic? It does to an extent. More specifically, I think the composite is a combination of Corinthian and a particular kind of Ionic, which we'll see later on. But we do have volutes, and we have two pairs of volutes, outer volutes and inner volutes. And here, in this particular version of Corinthian that we see at the Temple of Castor and Pollux, the inner volutes are handled in a unique manner. They are intertwined, is the word that I use. You see how, what I mean by looking at the picture. And then above them is a band of this, something that we call by a French name. The Romans wouldn't have called it by a French name, but we call it rinceau, which actually ultimately derives from the Latin for branch, but which in our usage really means that kind of swirling foliage, which is, almost always like a good way to use up empty space. And then right in the center is that big flower, a rosette, let us call it. These are Calder's photographs of the capitals of the Temple of Castor and Pollux as they exist today, where you can see there's a certain amount of detail that has not worn off over time, including those intertwined volutes are still very visible in those column capitals. Isn't that an amazing thing? that so much of this temple has disappeared, has just vanished into the mists of history, and yet this very delicate detail, this unique and very beautiful detail, has somehow survived. Not only survived, but also inspired other architects. For instance, James Gibbs uses uh, a slight variant on the Castor and Pollux Corinthian in his Church of St. Martin in the Fields on Trafalgar Square in London. It's hard to see because column capitals are so damnably difficult to photograph. You can, even if you have a super zoom lens and you can get infinite detail, you still can't get them level. So you're always frustrated when you're photographing column capitals. But hazy as this photo might be, do look and you'll see those intertwined volutes, and you'll see basically the whole arrangement of acanthus, volutes, and the band of rinceaux also above them. Now, this is back to Palladio's drawing of the Temple of Castor and Pollux. This is a much more accurate version, because Palladio did not have the benefit of modern archaeology. Palladio was being highly speculative. But nowadays, we've had people digging and dating and reconstructing sort of not quite nonstop, but pretty steadily for another 400 years. And we have now a much, much better idea, so that some of these people, like this painter named Gilbert Gorski, who, like the computer guy before, whose name I can't pronounce, have made a whole livelihood out of creating these images. So this is what the Temple of Castor and Pollux probably looked like. It had, as Palladio was correct in pointing out, the acroteria figures, the figural tympanum, but what Palladio did not know is that it had that very grand flight of steps. This is what's left. Now, this is what remains of the Temple of Vesta in Tivoli. This was a circular temple. Now, we saw a circular temple last week, the thing that the Greeks called a tholos, the sanctuary of Athena Pronaia, 20 columns in the round, a building which, when you first saw it, you might have thought looked more Roman than Greek. Well, the Romans thought it looked more Roman than Greek too, and for that reason, they emulated it. They did so in a whole series of circular temples, of which this is one of the most famous. Here is Piranesi's rendering, which appears to be quite accurate. And this is the Corinthian order of the Temple of Vesta. It's at first similar, right, to the Corinthian of the Temple of Castor and Pollux, because you have the same sort of base of acanthus leaves. But when you look at it closer, like in Degodetz's rendering, you see that the inner volutes are very different from those of the Castor and Pollux example. Here you have the inner volutes which do not meet, much less intertwine. They're separated. And then there is that sort of giant hibiscus flower in the middle. And then look up in the entablature, and you see a big, very heavy fruit garland. These garlands, sometimes called swags, are a very important ornamental feature of classical buildings. And then you have what is really kind of, to some people, creepy, because it's a bovine skull that we call a Bucrane. Why? Why would that, of all things, why would that become a standard ornamental feature of Roman buildings and of classical buildings going forward? We'll get back to that in a second. But here I want you to compare side by side the two Corinthians, the Corinthian of Vesta, Tivoli on the left, and the Corinthian of Castor and Pollux on the right. And the similarities are easy enough to see. They're mostly in the lower portion, not identical, but very, very, very similar. But up above, the differences are clear. The rendering of the volutes, just as we saw last week in comparing the volutes of the Erechtheum Ionic with that of the temple on the Ilissos. So here, the volutes can be rendered very differently. They can be tightly wound, they can be a little loosey-goosey, they can be sort of rendered in different ways. And what all of these sort of small calibrations do is, as Sir John Summerson says, they alter the mood. They don't communicate anything highly specific, but they alter the mood of a building. When something's wound tight, it produces a different mood than something which is wound very loosely. And here, there are so many features that can be wound tight or wound loosely. And we see in Castor and Pollux that those inner volutes sort of meet and embrace and intertwine, and that doesn't happen in the Vesta example. So let's compare those with an example of Greek Corinthian, which I showed at the end of last week, that of the Choragic monument of Lysicrates, where you have the sort of base of acanthus leaves, though they're rendered very differently, and they're also kind of stuck with rosettes. And then you have, but you do have the inner volutes and the outer volutes. The inner volutes of the Choragic monument meet, they touch, but they don't embrace the way the ones of Vesta do, whereas the volutes at the ones of Castor and Pollux do, whereas the ones from Vesta don't touch at all. They actually are socially distanced volutes. That is the volute equivalent of 6 feet apart. So here we have arrows all over the place. I'm sorry, I try to avoid that, but it just happened, showing in each instance the outer volutes and the inner volutes. And another thing worth noting is, and these are all very subtle differences, but they're the sorts of things that you want to keep an eye out for when you're looking at these buildings. Here, you see that the flutes of the column itself, not of the capital, but of the column below the capital, they rise up to curved heads, whereas at the Temple of Vesta, they rise up to square or flat heads. In New York, an example of the Temple of Vesta order can be seen in building of the Brooklyn Historical Society on Pierpont Street on Brooklyn Heights. Building built 1878-81, designed by an architect named George B. Post. It's a wonderful building, but it's a spirited, I think very charming rendering of that Corinthian order. There's the Temple of Vesta at Tivoli, and it was the inspiration for Sir John Soane's Bank of England building. And another thing that that I pointed out a moment ago is that thing that we call a bucrane. Why a, a bovine skull? It could be a cow, it could be an ox, but it's a skull. The basically this relates to um, sacrificial practices. Um, and and so that image of the skull, the animal skull, was to the Romans, because of their religion, a very important and meaningful image. It isn't for us. To us, it's just sort of creepy, but we still use it. For instance, you can all see that I'm sitting in the main reading room of the New York Public Library. And elsewhere in this building, I'll show you 3 instances in the New York Public Library where you can find a bucrane in those magnificent bronze flagpole bases on the Fifth Avenue terrace of the building. There is a bucrane. Inside, on these magnificent Carrara marble candelabra in the Astor Hall, right at the bottom, there is a bucrane. And outside, it may be a little hard to see in the photo, but these are what they used to call comfort stations. It's in Bryant, it's part of Bryant Park, but it was actually built as part of the library, and like the library designed by Crayon Hastings, there's a bucrane. There's a whole bunch of these bucranes all round the sides of this building. So it is another of those Roman forms that continues to enrich our modern cities of today. Date of those New York Public Library bucranes is 1911. This is the Maison Carrée in Nîmes. To many people, this is one of the most beautiful, but also most Greek-like of the Roman temples. A building also very, very famous and much loved because of how splendidly intact it is for, reasons that, are, I'm sure lots of people can tell you exactly why this is intact and why only 3 columns of the Temple of Castor and Pollux are still there. But this is just how it is. Some things survive over time. Very often, when new uses were found for these buildings, we talk about today adaptive reuse of old buildings. The adaptive reuse of old temples was very often to turn them into Christian churches. And when that happened, there was a much better chance that it was going to survive than if it just, was abandoned. This is pseudo-peripteral hexastyle. And there we see the side with the engaged columns that are attached or embedded or stuck to the wall rather than freestanding apart from the wall, such as you see in the front of the building. And you all probably know that this was Thomas Jefferson's favorite building, or one of his favorite buildings. From the time that he spent in France, he explored this building with a French architect named Charles-Louis Clérisseau. And Clérisseau helped Jefferson design the Virginia State Capitol of 1785-88, which was self-consciously based on the Maison Carrée, but with obviously many modifications, including swapping out the Corinthian order of the Maison Carrée for the Ionic order chosen by Jefferson and Clérisseau. By the way, this is what it looked like. At first, it took a very long time before the stairs were put in. This is a reconstruction of the Temple of Saturn in Rome. And what's interesting, this is the Temple of Saturn as it is today. Yeah? So you can see that that front colonnade is interestingly intact. But one thing that you'll notice about the Ionic order this time of the Temple of Saturn is the way that the volutes are angled. Rather than a Corinthian column with just the volutes on either side, here each capital has 4 volutes, and they are angled from outward. Now, later on, this would become known by the name of a Renaissance architect named Vincenzo Scamozzi, and we would call it the Scamozzi Ionic. But clearly, it long predates Scamozzi. Just neither here nor there. I just wanted to show this painting by Hubert Robert, who often made very affecting paintings of buildings. And by the way, he was a favorite painter of the late Henry Hope Reed. This is the interior of the Temple of Diana at Nîmes. And this is what it actually looks like today. So it hasn't, it changed a lot between the time of ancient Rome and the 18th century, but changed very, very little from the 18th century to today. And then, of course, the most famous, the most dramatic, the most important Roman temple of them all is the Pantheon in Rome, AD 120 to 124. It has that big inscription across the front, which means Marcus Agrippa, son of Lucius, 3 times consul, built this. It's kind of like Donald Trump, son of Fred, built this. But really, it's the first thing you notice about the building is just that giant inscription in the frieze. Second thing you notice about the building is that it has a naked tympanum. There are no figures in there. Were there once? No. Sometimes there just aren't. And the third thing you notice about it is that it has that perfectly, basically ordinary column front. And that was the first thing that the ancient Romans noticed about the building as well, which led them to think that as they were entering it, they were entering a conventional temple, that maybe they were entering, a conventional pseudo-peripteral octastyle temple. But once they went through the big bronze doors of the Pantheon, they were shocked. The building was designed so that the portico of the building really set you up for something as different as can be from the inside of the building. And when you got on the inside, you were in a space that was simply overwhelming. Space that peaks at 150 feet high, that incredible dome comprising 140 square coffers. What made this building, this incredible technical feat possible was, of course, the use of concrete. And not only that, but the use of many kinds or grades or mixtures of concrete. The engineering was quite brilliant, so that the weight of the concrete based on the aggregate itself lessens as the building rises. And it is, as you know, from these paintings by one of my favorite painters, Giovanni Paolo Panini, who did wonderful architectural paintings, give you a very good sense of it. But of course, modern photographs, like this one that I found on Flickr, can really sort of bring it home for you in a way only equaled by actually going there. Thing is that when you actually go there today, you see an interior that has only a fraction of the original ornament that this interior had. Uh, so we, um, I know that there are lots of people who think, oh, it's probably better without the ornament. I am not one of those people, and I can't help thinking that as impressive, as awe-inspiring as this building is for for 21st century people when they see it, we're used to great technological stunts. We're used to mega structures. We're used to tremendous engineering feats. And yet, sometimes an ancient building can make our jaw drop. That's what the Pantheon does. Imagine if you were alive at the time and you were far less used to the things that we're used to, and the building was also so much more richly ornamented than it is today. The impact of it must have been simply mind-blowing. There you are. Other building types: basilicas, bathhouses, palaces. A basilica. Now, when we use that word today, we use it most often in connection with churches. You know that there are two uses of the word basilica in reference to churches. Number one use is that there is the Basilican plan church, the church with the nave and aisles, which is most churches. The second use is that it's actually a designation that the Vatican gives to certain important churches, churches that are associated with saints or this or that. They will give them this designation so that it's no longer the church of Saint so-and-so. It becomes the Basilica of Saint so-and-so, and it's like a loftier thing. But in its original use, basilica did not refer to churches. It referred to a plan. And we see it here. We see it in this image from Sir Bannister Fletcher's A History of Architecture, where there is that sort of great long central hall and then colonnades which separate that hall from side aisles. This is what a basilica is. And so the plan could serve any number of uses. It could serve sort of the purposes of administrative buildings. It could serve the purposes of commercial buildings, and so on. And this is a reconstruction of the interior of Trajan's Basilica in Rome. And as you can see, it's a very lofty space, very impressive space. Now, let's look at bathhouses, because they're a lot of fun. Caracalla, I did not say this when I showed those two slides of Baalbek in Lebanon, but it was Caracalla who built Baalbek. And if anybody ever thought in terms of the scale, it was the Emperor Caracalla. Now, the baths of Caracalla aren't the biggest. The baths of Diocletian are bigger than the baths of Caracalla, but the baths of Caracalla are nonetheless this incredibly impressive thing. Now, a bathhouse, this is a word that doesn't actually begin to suggest what these complexes, because they weren't buildings, they were complexes. This is the model in the Roman Civic Museum by Gismondi. You can see by looking at this that there is this sort of arcaded enclosure spanning many acres. I should know how many acres it was, but I don't. But it was a complex, and it included not only the bathing facilities, hot and cold baths, but all manner of sort of ancillary functions that were geared toward relaxation. These were, by the way, public bathhouses. They were part of what the emperor sort of gave to the people. You could go there and you could bathe, you could swim, you could do this or that, but also within the complex, there were restaurants, there were bars, there were brothels, there were, here we see a plan. And I put an arrow pointing to the caldarium, which is the hot bath, an arrow pointing to the frigidarium, which is the cold bath, an arrow pointing to the Great Hall, an arrow pointing to the main entrance, and arrows pointing to the libraries, because, yeah, why not? There were libraries, that public libraries that were part of the bathhouse complex. Many famous decorative features of the baths of Caracalla have ended up elsewhere. The marble mosaics in those library floors, known as the athletic mosaics, are in the Vatican Museum today, and most famously the Farnese Hercules, which is in the Archaeological Museum of Naples. This Roman copy of a Greek bronze original was in fact originally in the baths of Caracalla. And you can visit the ruins today, and here mosaic floors are intact. In the bigger baths of Diocletian, AD 302, Diocletian also thought on a large scale. These two are very famous. Here is an engraving from the 17th century showing this vast bathhouse complex. This is Beaux-Arts architect's rendering from 1880. Edmond Poulain was also a Prix de Rome winner. And this is the same image. You can see the vaulted ceilings. Now, the dome and the vault were used by Romans. We saw the dome of the Pantheon, but the vaulted passages were used in the grander buildings. They were used in the bathhouses, and they were used, as we shall see, in the palaces. This is the model of the Baths of Diocletian, which you find in the Civic Museum in Rome. And here we see the sort of higher view. You see how much real estate this takes up. What is this, like 10 acres? And there are the very distinctive windows of the Baths of Diocletian. We think of them as bathhouse windows, which have been widely adapted throughout Western architecture. If you go to Columbia University, Low Library has what we call a Diocletian window from the Baths of Diocletian. But more interesting than that is the Doric order of the Baths of Diocletian. Now, the Doric, we looked last week at the Doric of the Parthenon, and it's a marvelous Doric because of how it is proportioned, because of the extraordinary subtlety of the details of the echinus, but it isn't heavily ornamented Doric, nor do we in general expect a Doric capital to be heavily ornamented. We know that the Ionic admits of a certain amount of embellishment, and the Corinthian is about nothing but embellishment. But the Doric is all about that sort of soldierly strength, and we don't expect the soldier to be wearing a necklace and earrings. But that is not always the case. Sometimes the Doric can be enriched, and I love the enrichment of this Diocletian Doric. you see that at the, the echinus, as we call it, which is the space between the necking and the abacus. I should have my red arrows here, and I don't. But you see the band at the top of the column that's set with the rosettes. That's the neck or necking. Above that is the echinus, which normally swells a bit. Here, it has a very distinctive swell. It's almost like an S curve. And there are two kinds of curves. There is the egg curve, or the ovolo, and the cavetto curve, or the cave curve. So an ovolo curve swells outward, a cavetto curve swells inward. And when you have a molding where the ovolo is below the cavetto, we call that a cyma recta or chyma recta. And where the ovolo is above the cavetto, we call it a cyma reversa or chyma reversa. And this, oh, hey, I do have arrows. Here we see what we would call a foliated, meaning it's ornamented with floral forms, with leaves, a foliated cyma recta echinus, a necking with rosettes, and below that, the narrow band, we would call it astragal, and it's ornamented with a simple bead and reel, such as we saw used so often in Greek architecture. A beautiful version, an almost perfect version of the Diocletian Doric, as we would call it, is to be found. Not perfect, it doesn't have the bead and reel astragal, but it does have the foliated cyma recta echinus and rosettes in the necking. Is at Stanford White's Metropolitan Club on Fifth Avenue and 60th Street, a building with a number of really wonderful details. And then we also saw in the Diocletian order that the metopes, that is the space remember from last week, in between the triglyphs in the Doric and the Doric frieze, that the metopes are ornamented with these masks of Apollo, and that too has with the rays shooting out, and we see that too has been adapted, for instance, by Thomas Jefferson at the University of Virginia. So these Roman forms have had lives much longer than the Roman Empire itself. Palaces. This is one of the biggest and baddest palaces ever built, the Domus Aurea, or Nero's palace in Rome. This did, in fact, take up 200 acres. It was built using largely concrete, and in the centerpiece was what had to have been the scariest statue ever built, this 100-foot high statue of Nero. This is a map showing the Domus Aurea in relation to the city around it, and parts of it survive. Enough of it survives to give us a sense of the scale and majesty of the space, the vaulted ceiling with remarkable decoration, both painted decoration and low relief sculptural decoration with these very thin, delicate lines. All the lines are very attenuated, and everything about it is really just very sort of elegant and a little bit dainty. That's the word that I was trying to think of. Here we see side by side the ruin and the reconstruction. Some of the painting still exists. Robert Adam, the Scottish-born British architect who was so immensely influential in the late 18th century, sort of man whose work our own uh, federal style American architecture was based on, um, uh, used the Domus Aurea as a principal source for the very distinctive ornamentation, very dainty ornamentation that he used in his buildings. And someone else who was inspired by the Domus Aurea was Raphael when he designed the Villa Madama in Rome. The ceiling decoration there, not by Raphael, but by Giovanni Dodini, is based on that of the Domus Aurea. And this is a New York building with a very exciting rotunda ornamented by Siddons Mowbray, both in paint and in mosaic and in low relief sculpture, which he said was based on the Villa Madama, but in fact, since the Villa Madama was based on the Domus Aurea, so too may we say the Morgan Library Rotunda was based on the Domus Aurea, which had, as we saw before, this very exciting vaulted space. And Laocoon and his sons was once in that space, as we see from a rendering by yet another Beaux-Arts architect, Georges Paul Chedin. And Robert Adam, you know, was also involved in the excavations of Diocletian's palace in Split, or Spalatro as it was called at the time, in Dalmatia, and made some memorable renderings of the site, which also deeply influenced his own practice as an architect. And this is his rendering of what is called the peristyle of Diocletian's palace, and this is what it looks like today. When it can be visited, more Robert Adam, and this is a reconstruction of this vast palace complex as it appeared circa AD 300. Now, Diocletian this was not like Diocletian's country retreat. This was Diocletian's headquarters. This was a great administrative center. It was a huge operation, like thousands of people involved, its own docks. It was just a massive, and when the Roman Empire fell apart, you know, people just sort of like your sort of rambling Goths and Vandals and what have you, moved in to Diocletian's palace, and it became a town. I mean, that's how big it was. It actually sort of had adaptive reuse as a city. So as we wind down, let's look at what's most important among the inheritances from our inheritances from Roman architecture. And that begins with what may be the most characterizing Roman form of them all. I mean, we have quadrigas and rostral columns and this and that, but the triumphal arch was a very specifically Roman thing. Greeks had no triumphal arches, but everybody's had triumphal arches since the Romans. We Americans, or the Americans among us, since not everybody listening in is from the US, not least among those builders of triumphal arches in the wake of the Romans. The Arch of Titus is made of Pentelic marble, which is the marble of the Acropolis in Athens. And there's some really beautiful high relief carving on the Arch of Titus. It's a wonderful arch. It is a single arch, triumphal arch. notable for the very prominent attic, which is prominent not least because it must bear a very long inscription, which is an important element in Roman triumphal arches. The inscription tells you a story. It is meant to be read. Here's another view. And as you can see, the beautiful spandrel figures in the arch of the winged angels, that imagery, that specific spandrel imagery has been very influential down through the years. We see it in Byzantine art, we see it in the Renaissance, we see it in 20th century New York. This is this is the Arch of Septimius Severus is more elaborate in the sense that it has three openings, a high central opening and two lower flanking openings. It has the big attic. The sculpture, so far as we can make out, is fine, but maybe not as good. And there we see the vaulted passage through the arch. Canaletto's painting of the Arch of Septimius Severus. This finally is the Arch of Constantine from as late as AD 312. The statues in the tablature are very, very effective. And the triumphal arch is important not because people have gone on building triumphal arches, freestanding triumphal arches, although, you know, there are certainly those. There is the Arc de Triomphe de l'Étoile in Paris, and the Arc de Triomphe du Carrousel in Paris, and there is the Washington Square Arch in New York, and the Great Arch in Brooklyn. Arches, freestanding arches everywhere. But rather, it is a design resource for the way that it has sort of generated whole building designs. Nowhere is that more obvious than in Alberti Sant'Andrea in Mantua, where the whole building inside and out is basically based on the triumphal arch motif. It's a series of triumphal arches that are that form these shallower and longer barrel vaults. And if you were to look around New York, you would see in a building like the Apthorpe apartment building on Broadway between 78th and 79th Streets, this great triumphal arch, which is embedded in the center of the building, which forms the entrance to the building's courtyard through that very impressive vault. And I must say that although the artists were anonymous, the figures, the spandrel figures, are absolutely first rate. Now, just let me say a quick word about Trajan's column. This is another commemorative form, like quadriga, like a triumphal arch, a high column surmounted by a statue. This isn't a rostral column. It's a commemorative column, though, which is decorated around the column shaft by an amazing number of images. Images that are all, I'm sorry, I just, from the Dacian Wars, which had been won by Trajan. There are 155 scenes depicted in the minutest detail. This is absolutely thrilling stuff. I doubt that the Romans ever did anything in sculpture to equal Trajan's column. Um, and yet, what's kind of amazing is that never at any point um, has it been possible to study it up close, with the consequence that there is some likelihood that no human being has ever studied all the images on Trajan's column. And it's even possible that not all the images have even been photographed, which is just sort of mind-boggling. I just thought I'd throw these in, not that they work in this context. And then there's the column of Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius, some of these Romans are very chic figures today, the Stoics. We met the founding Stoic, Zeno of Citium, last week. But a lot of these Romans were Stoic philosophers. Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, those two in particular, are very fashionable today, because I don't know why this is. There's just so much about the world that I find utterly mysterious, but they're very fashionable among Silicon Valley tech millionaires. But anyway, you hear about them all the time. I mean, you'll open up a copy of, Fast Company magazine. There'll be an article about, how to think like Marcus Aurelius. I'm not making this up. And Bill Clinton claimed to be like a devotee of Marcus Aurelius. I've always thought that Marcus Aurelius was a guy that if I met him, I would not like him. But however that may be, I'm happy to report, based on that his column just doesn't hold a candle to Trajan's column. It has some impressive imagery, but it's just not as good. The detail is nowhere near as good. I mean, nowhere near as good. So anyway, you have that. This is the location of Marcus Aurelius's column, just in case you were wondering. Okay, and now we come to the Colosseum. The Colosseum is one of the most famous buildings in the world. It's one of the great tourist attractions of Rome. It's a building which has riveted the attention of painters over the years. And yet, as landmarks go, has there ever been a landmark building that is just so associated with blood and squalor as the Colosseum? It was enormous. It was space for well more than 100,000 spectators. It had 76 numbered exits and entrances. I mean, this thing was on a vast scale, and what's more, it was used for 700 years. That said, what is it about it architecturally that is of note? And this is the building that, above all others, to me, tells us what exactly the Greek orders meant to the Romans. When you build a building based on the arch, you have no structural need of columns. The arches are supported on thick piers, and you can see that. You can see in this image to the right, where the columns that are affixed to the front of the Colosseum are no longer. You can see those thick piers, and you can see that the removal of the columns from in front of those piers does not cause the building to collapse. If you remove the columns of the Parthenon, the building collapses. Remove the columns from many Roman buildings, the building doesn't collapse. So, what's the deal with that? Why are the Romans still using the Greek columns if they are building buildings that have a structural system that doesn't require the columns. And this is the great contribution that the Romans made to Western architecture. This is what is stressed by Sir John Summerson in his great little book, The Classical Language of Architecture. It is that they transformed the Greek orders into something purely ornamental. Now, if you were weaned on sort of the worldview of much, not all, but much of modern architecture, then that sounds like a damning thing to say. They took something structural and they made it merely ornamental. That's sort of, if you were to say, instead, you hear somebody say they made it purely ornamental, and you sort of translate that in your head to merely ornamental. The Romans didn't think they were doing anything mere at all. They were not least paying homage to the Greeks, but also acknowledging that the Greeks had created a kind of language based on these columns. And that language was something that existed apart from the structure of the building. That the structure of the building wasn't what spoke. It was the forms in which that the structure was created. In this case, that is Doric columns, Ionic columns, and Corinthian columns. So the Romans took these columns and their entablatures, the whole order, and they placed them on the front of the building. And so wherever we see a building with arches and piers, and then the column that is placed in front of the pier, or we may say superimposed in front of the pier, we call that the Colosseum motif. Not that the Colosseum was the first building to do this, but it is certainly the most famous and obvious building to do this. There's the Colosseum in its setting. See, I get carried away with the red arrows sometimes. And there you are again. Now, there's another thing about, so here's an example of the Colosseum motif. This is Sansovino's Palazzo Corner in Venice, not to be confused with the Palazzo Correr in Venice. But here you see he's placed double columns in front of the piers between the arches. This is an example of the Colosseum motif. Here's Giulio Romano, the weird Giulio Romano, using those twisty Solomonic columns in front of the piers of his arcade. That's the Colosseum motif. And right around the corner from ICAA's national headquarters is this perfectly ordinary 1917 office building, not anything you'd look at twice if you were walking past it. But what do you have right there, looking right out at you on Fifth Avenue, but one of approximately 1,000 examples of the Colosseum motif to be found in New York City. And then there's another thing. Look at the very top story of the Colosseum. First of all, the Colosseum has an arrangement, story by story, of columns with Doric columns on the bottom, Ionic columns on the top, Corinthian columns above those. It is always done that way. And it's because of the apparent strength of the columns that you want the one with the greatest apparent strength on the bottom, where it appears, it's not actually, but it appears to be holding the most weight. That would be the Doric. Ionic, the second strongest. The Corinthian, is all kind of like fluttery and floral, so that's up top. But on the Attic story of the Colosseum, we have that thing that we call the pilaster, which is the flat representation in relief of a classical column. So it is a substitute for a column. It has the column base, the column shaft, the column capital, and it actually carries a full entablature as though it were a column. And you'll remember my last week saying that the Greeks employed not pilasters, but these things called ante, um, that, such as in the Karagic monument of Thrasyllis, uh, where I showed this and I said that whereas normally the Greek ante were just thick piers at the ends of temple fronts that actually were structural, in this particular work from 320 BC, they actually are given column capitals. And that may be regarded as the birth of the pilaster, which is another one of those things that the Romans would employ now and again, and that come the Italian Renaissance would be employed all the time. So let me just finish up here by showing you one thing that amuses me very greatly. This is an apartment building from the on Fifth Avenue in New York, 927 Fifth Avenue, a building that's very famous because it's the home of a red-tailed hawk that has become a kind of New York celebrity named Pale Male. But what has always struck me about this building, and again, so hard to photograph, but there is an eagle on the front of this building with a wreath round it. And then the wings of the eagle, as you can see, extend beyond that wreath, and there's a fluttering ribbon below to either side of the wreath. It's a very arresting image, a beautiful image, beautifully carved, of an eagle. That eagle is what we call Trajan's eagle. There is a church in Trajan's Forum in Rome that has a panel with this eagle on it. And it actually was removed from another structure in the Forum that is no longer and placed on the church that it's on now, but it was rendered by Piranesi, that's Trajan's eagle. And that image was borrowed by Warren and Wetmore when they designed that building. And I love the fact that Pale Male, the red-tailed hawk, of all the buildings on Fifth Avenue that it might have made home, chose a building that was ornamented with Trajan's eagle, as though it saw fellow birds on the front of the building and went to nest on that building because of that. But I also, quite apart from Pale Male, just love the fact that there's an expensive apartment building on Fifth Avenue with this Trajan's eagle by way of Piranesi on the front of it. And the final slide that I shall show tonight is a slide that I've already shown, but it's the Arch of Constantine, because you know that it was with the Emperor Constantine that not that the Roman Empire came to an end, but that Rome, the city of Rome as the center of the empire, the seat of the empire, came to an end. Constantine moved headquarters to Byzantium, which he duly renamed Constantinople. And in Constantinople, the Roman Empire continued, and it also became, in art historical terms, its own thing, something that we call Byzantine. And although we've not yet scheduled it, my next lecture, we will, I hope, schedule it soon. My next lecture in this series on the history of Western architecture will cover the architecture of Byzantium, Byzantine and early Christian architecture. So I hope that I will see you then. And I thank you all very, very much for sitting through tonight's talk. And I look forward to doing this again. Thank you.